For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Dr. Gavin Grant. Nobody uses the word doctor, just Gavin. Yes, and we're going to open up. We're talking about the future here. We've already talked about the past and kind of a bit of the present. And I'm going to ask our panel to introduce themselves, starting with yourself.
Okay, this is where I work. Some drone footage of the wetland reserve Castle Espy in the north end of Strangford Lough. And you'll see here a mosaic of wetland habitats. All, some are salt, some brackish, some fresh, tidal. There's salt marsh, all different types of wetland habitats. And these are actually old quarries. This is a former industrial site, and nature has subsumed this whole site, and it's now very biodiverse mixture of habitats, and just shows you what can be done and how nature can reclaim the land. And here we see the mudflats on the north shore. This is where lots of seagrass, and I'm pleased to note from Heidi's research that it actually is amongst the best on the loch. Isn't that right, Heidi? That's in no small part to our team at Castle Espy who manage these habitats. We also have Castle Espy have reed-bred filtration systems for wastewater. So even with the amount of human activity going on at the site, we still are able to manage our outputs into the loch, as it can be demonstrated it's working through the health of the seagrass. So here, you see this pier here. This is interesting because after some high wind events and the increasing amount of storms we're having, that is beginning to erode away, and we're worried, in fact, that that this will actually damage the seagrass beds which are behind it. So we are being threatened by climate change, and we are noticing a difference on site as a result of that. And here we see some of the seagrass that I've been talking about. These seagrass meadows, as I say, at Castle Espy are very healthy. And one of the contributions that this site makes to conservation on the loch, it's not just about the small area that we have here, it's about the example that this sets, and it's about engaging people with it and bringing people to it and telling the story of the loch. So that's the real power of Castle Espy. Because in many ways, it is only a small part of the loch. It's not about the bit that we look after. It's about engaging people with it and helping them to understand how things can be done. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Nick, a marine biologist, marine conservation manager at Ulster Wildlife, and mostly working around oyster restoration and native oyster restoration. But before I talk a bit about that, I kind of wanted to give a bit of background about how I ended up here. I live here in Portaferry and right on the shores. Well, I measured earlier 1/2 mile from the shores of Strangford Lough. And I did my studies in Portsmouth and Aberdeen, and then moved to this island out to the west coast of Mayo in 2017 to a little area out 1/2 an hour past Belmullet, if anyone's been out to Mayo and knows that Belmullet is the end over there. And then you go 1/2 an hour beyond that, and then the next stop would have been America if I'd have carried on going. So I went from 6 months over in Mayo working with UCC, and then moved to the metropolis of Portaferry after that, which was a nice big town like this, upgrade after the hill I lived on in Mayo. So I moved here to do my PhD at Queen's University, Belfast, at the Marine Lab down here, and studied interactions around tidal energy and the potential, important to say potential, impacts they might have on the marine environment, for example, on seals potentially colliding. So my work focused around trying to understand and predict the likelihood of any impacts from tidal energy developments on species like seals. So I spent the 3.5 years getting through that, survived, and finished my PhD, and did a few years as a postdoc at Queen's after that, continuing to work on renewable energy projects and looking into the potential tech kind of avenues to solve these kind of problems. And it got very engineering, very serious, and I spent my spare time listening to podcasts and audiobooks about rewilding and nature and the marine environment. And actually Christine lent me a really good book by Professor Callum York on the history of our oceans, and I think really fantastic to look back at, like the panel did this morning, was looking back and talking about that huge abundance of life that we had in our seas many years ago. And that combination of listening about rewilding podcasts and reading books like that told us about the past and what we could maybe do in the future, I had that ticking away in my brain. And then a nice job came up at Ulster Wildlife, working in native oyster restoration. And while I read native oyster restoration, I basically saw marine rewilding, getting to bring back more nature and put it into our seas and trying to repair some of the damage that some practices have had over the years. And so that work at Ulster Wildlife is, like I say, talking about native oysters, not the Pacific oyster you might see in a restaurant. That's what we see farmed around our shores, is Pacific oyster. The native oyster is a somewhat lost species. Really what has been lost is oyster habitat, oyster reef habitat. Around the UK, Ireland, Europe, we would have had miles upon miles of oyster reefs that were essentially fished, mostly 90% fished, and then disease then ravaged those last pockets of populations. And so that habitat, that oyster reef habitat, is functionally extinct from our shores, something that we're trying to work to return. Whilst the work that I'm doing now is mostly focused around Belfast Lough for that. There's certain water quality issues around Belfast Lough that people might be aware of. And we're working to bring native oysters back to those areas and to promote their restoration, and sort of seeing the benefits of those nature-based solutions about bringing back native oysters, because they're fantastic for biodiversity, and obviously that's core at Ulster Wildlife's needs. But they're also fantastic for cleaning up the water and water quality, protecting our coasts and stuff like that. So it's not just about nature, but it's also about the benefits to people that these kind of restoration efforts can have. And so we don't just work on oysters, we also work on other habitats and species. And so yesterday I was on Strangford Lough looking with our ROV for seagrass around moorings in combination with Newry and Down, on that work, looking at potential places to do restorations here in Strangford Lough around seagrass. And Bob mentioned about this, where the ocean connection is, and for me, I wanted to mention, like I said, I live half a mile from the shores, and recently learned that there's some water behind our house, that a little pond and wetland behind our house, and I found out that is actually connected to Strangford Lough. That water right there goes down under Portaferry, because I don't know if you noticed, there's no stream going through Portaferry. Under Portaferry and into Strangford Lough. So those impacts that we have, whether we change the way we manage our land inland, is going to affect Strangford Lough. And so that connection is, I learned I'm a bit more connected to the loch than I thought I was living here in Portaferry, even though, well, that's that final bit that I wanted to mention about me personally, and is I spend a lot of time out on the shores of the loch, spend time on the loch, here in Portaferry, in Nugent's Woods, Ballyhenry Island, Ballyquinton Point, out at Knockanelder, Millen Bay, looking for wildlife, looking to photograph wildlife. Some of the best things with the dolphins hanging around is just fantastic. And Ballyhenry, getting to see otters, spent an hour watching 2 otters frolicking around. There's no kids, they were frolicking. Yeah, so a really amazing place to see an abundance of nature and some really fantastic species out there, and it really is a personal connection of mine to this kind of area, is being able to just go out and spend time amongst those amazing creatures. And so that's why I do what I do, and that connection, and bring it back a bit more to that, the future looking. I wanted to get out my crystal ball, this crystal ball, about what I might see as the future in Strangford Lough and around our coasts and our places. And I can imagine I'm probably going to say native oysters everywhere. That'd be quite nice. But really is about, I think, a big kind of thing for me is about balance and harmony, and about bringing in nature and these spaces for our lochs and our seas that are not just for nature alone and not just for people alone, but finding the harmony and balance that we can have a thriving ocean with abundance, like that book mentioned about the thriving oceans and abundance of fish and species, but bringing that in, that it benefits people and it benefits nature, because one without the other is not going to work. So that's kind of my future look, is finding that balance and finding that harmony. So I hope we can move towards that kind of way of living where nature is as much part of our lives as the other things that we have going on. So thank you.
Good stuff. Thanks very much, Nick. And Christine, if you're ready.
So I studied marine biology at Liverpool University, late 80s, early 90s. And it was such a fabulous place at the time. We had a marine station, and part of the reason for going there was the marine lab was on the Isle of Man with a long history of marine biology research. And you got to spend your final year, the entire year, at the marine station. That's sadly gone. I'm at Queen's University Marine Lab just down the road, which I'll show you in a minute. And I think it's really important, the connection that the Marine Lab has had with marine biology and outreach as well in this community. And marine stations, I think, have such an important role to play in what we're all discussing today. And so I hope Portaferry Marine Lab, which celebrated its 80th anniversary last year, will be there at least for another 80 years and into the future. So after I graduated, I worked a lot on a big survey around the Republic of Ireland, where we were diving and recording imagery from the seabed and surveying what was found there. And then we made recommendations as to the sites that would be included in Natura 2000 for a network of marine protected areas that would protect a lot of the biodiversity, and which sites were the most important for that. I did a PhD on marine sponges, so that's really my main love and my main area of expertise. And Nick was saying about how oysters once thrived, and yet there's no oyster reefs left. There's little pockets of individuals. And for me, sponges are also the canary in the mine. They're filter feeding. They're very sensitive. They're very diverse. They've got no skin. They can't move. So they're subjected to the environmental conditions, and they really are an indicator of the health of the ecosystem. And they're something that has been impacted in a lot of areas too. But what I was going to mention today was the project I'm currently working on. So I said about the survey I did around the Republic of Ireland, along with Bernard Picton at the back here. He led the team, but Bernard's been involved in surveying the marine biodiversity around Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland since the 1970s. And there was a real important archive of underwater imagery, as well as imagery from our shores, that was all sitting in boxes and wasn't available to anyone. So I wrote a proposal, and in 2023 we got funding from DERA to really put all of this imagery and data about species and distributions into a website that would be available to everyone. And our partners in this are CEDAR, which Anna is here somewhere at the back. So that's our biological record centre in Northern Ireland. So this is the marine station here. Are any of you, is this your first time in Portaferry for anyone? Okay, so literally just down where the ferry goes, that's where Queen's University Marine Lab is. So the archive imagery aspect of the project. So here are some photographs with a really important habitat that Bob mentioned in his talk about the horse mussels in Strangford Reef, these queen scallop and horse mussel reefs. And these photos were taken back in, I think it's in 1985, does it say there? Yeah. So that's what the seabed looked like at that point in time. So that survey, all of those images, they come up full screen in the portal, as well as the species list that was recorded at that time. As well as the imagery from the surveys that was done in the 80s, we've had an ongoing legacy of quite intensive marine surveys in Northern Ireland. So putting this all together that people can access it. The main driver was for monitoring change, but it has a huge potential for outreach as well. Most people, when they look out, they see the surface of the sea. They don't get to see what's beneath. Some places are fantastic. We do have a wealth of marine life, but other places are in peril, and I'm afraid to say Strangford Lough is one of them. You know, we've seen huge changes in degradation in Lough Neagh, nutrient levels impacting with other trophic levels, and then algal blooms that are harmful, dinoflagellates, etc., the blue-green algae. The nutrient levels in Strangford Lough in the North End are also rocketing, and the habitats are degrading. There's been a big spread in non-native species. This habitat has completely gone. So there was a survey commissioned in 2003, Strangford Lough Ecological Change. Sorry, I've got the gloomy ball. My crystal ball's a bit dark, I think. But they were looking for this habitat, these horse mussel reefs, as well as some of the other habitats. And they did video transects, and they are all in the portal, which Libby was demonstrating at lunchtime. All of the videos are there, as well as the species lists, etc. We went back out to the sites where there were little pockets remaining in 2003. We went out in February this year, and we didn't find a single horse mussel. Not just the reef was gone, they've all gone. Now, what is causing that? There's been a ban on the bottom fishing in Strangford for some time now, so is it just not recovering? There's also rumours that some trawlers have come in and fished in the area, in the exclusion zone, so we don't know. Other people say it's a northern species, maybe it's temperature, but there are individual horse mussels up as far around Mahee Island and Skettrick on the shore, which would experience much higher temperatures, so and the horse mussel occurs in the Bay of Biscay, so I don't think it's the temperature is the main driver. It's either hasn't recovered at all and has continued to be degraded by how Strangford Lough is being managed, or else the fishing, there has been ongoing fishing activity surreptitiously and illegally. But when you drive down the peninsula, drive down here most days, there's convoys of slurry trucks. You see how the land is being managed, and that is all going straight into Strangford Lough. So yeah, I think we need to start not just thinking about how marine areas are managed, but also the catchment and the interaction with the land. So yeah, that's me being really gloomy. It's just, we were really shocked. We went out in February. We do a lot of survey work up in Rathlin, and it looks lovely. And then we're just looking in Strangford and going, you know, and for Bernard especially, who was diving here from the 70s, and this was one of the first places he dived, it's very hard to see that amount of loss. And yet this is in one of the most protected areas as far as the marine environment goes. So, yeah. So this is just a little bit more about the portal. This is me having my little emotional rant over about Strangford Lough. But yeah, there's really nice footage of what the sites are like. It's all done with high resolution cameras now, and you can go in and explore the underwater sites from the comfort and safety of your house without getting cold or wet. So yeah. This is just a little bit on how the site works. So you can go in through a mapping site and see all of the survey sites that there are around Northern Ireland. You can zoom in, pick on a particular site, and then when you can choose which years you're interested in. And then if you click where it says, is that video details or site record or something? I don't know what it actually says, that blue bit. If you click on that, that takes you to videos, underwater videos about that site, still photographs, etc., and the species that you can find there. Another aspect of our project is we're trying to build up a reference library of DNA barcodes to help us better understand our biodiversity. So sometimes this is for prioritizing DNA barcodes for the species that are conservation status when a DNA barcode doesn't exist, to assist future monitoring of those species using environmental DNA. It can be for the non-native species to help us be able to identify them from water samples, but also what we're realizing when we do this, that some of the species we have are actually a whole complex of species that need to be better understood. There's a conservation element, so the priority species, priority habitats, non-Indigenous species, we have identification resources for those and information about them. And then we do community engagement. This is some of the discoveries. Little nudibranch, that's a northern species, recorded for the first time off copelands. This was a new seagrass bed that Rebecca was out with Bernard, etc., and found a new seagrass bed in Strangford. So that's a good news story. There's a video about that species list. It's all on the portal. Oops. That's another one, a second one we found. There's lots of marine life identification and workshops. And we also have a citizen science project on iNaturalist where people can go out and record and feed in. So you can see there's over 13,000 records on it now of over 1,000 marine species from Northern Ireland. So that's it. And that's the QR.
Thanks very much, Christine. Just a bit. But we're grand. So, Rebecca, if you're ready.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So my name is Rebecca. I'm based at the Marine Station here in Portaferry. So last year I graduated with my degree in marine biology from Queen's University, and as part of that degree I'd done a placement year with Ulster Wildlife working on their native oyster restoration project. I've been volunteering a little bit previously with them on that same project, so I have a little bit of background in kind of oysters and shellfish. At the minute I'm doing a PhD at Queen's. It's very broad, so the best way that I have found to describe what I do is that I work in shellfish but I dabble in seagrass. So it's kind of multiple biogenic habitats. So as part of that, as Christine mentioned, we did find some seagrass beds in Strangford, which is really nice, that had previously been unmapped. So we found one just south of Portaferry in Grana Bay and one up near Grey Abbey. So in terms of my actual PhD research, my topic is trying to future-proof marine habitat restoration. So I'm interested in the effects of global change processes such as climate change, but not exclusive to that. And I'm trying to work out how are they changing the marine environment in Strangford Lough and elsewhere. And then how do we need to change the way that we restore marine systems so that any kind of change is not outpacing the impacts of what we're trying to restore. So it's very much kind of future orientated, so I am constantly kind of projecting and forecasting to try and work out what is going to change and how quickly is it going to change. But everything I do is very deeply rooted in the past research that has happened. So I'm trying to use, all of the other PhD projects and research and work that has gone into shellfish and seagrass restoration, any kind of work in Strangford, and then try and combine it with current data and use that to forecast into the future, and then to try and make some recommendations for what we need to change now to make sure that we do actually have a chance at having some kind of an effect in our restoration practices. So I've been really, really privileged over the last few years to be surrounded by some really, really passionate scientists, divers at the Marine Lab. So I've been able to kind of build a really strong connection to Strangford Lough, even though I'm, literally 1 or 2 years in, very early days, and it's nothing in comparison with most of the other people that I work with. So I've been very privileged to kind of be able to be mentored by people and really build a connection to Strangford. But a way in which I find that I connect best to not just Strangford Lough, but to the marine environment in general, is to engage with other people about it. So I do a little bit of engagement work. I work as Wild Belfast's engagement officer. And if there's any kind of an opportunity to help out in an event or do anything like that, I really enjoy having the chance just to chat to other people about marine environments. So, you know, over the last couple of years, I've been so surprised at the impact that a chat can have if you just talk to anyone. It doesn't have to be a scientist, it can just be, you know, someone you meet on the street, someone you meet at an event, and if you just start chatting to them about oysters or seagrass, you'll be absolutely amazed at what they tell you. The amount of times where we've kind of thought, oh, we need to, you know, try and design a really specific research project, go out and have these really clear objectives, and you turn around and talk to someone, and they're like, yeah, I could have told you that like 5 years ago. You know, we knew about that all along. So I think, yeah, for me, a really important way of trying to continue to connect to the marine environment and to engage with Strangford Lough is just to talk to people about it. And you know, the Marine Lab and other places are a really, really good way to try and do that. So yeah, kind of in summary, my work is trying to future-proof marine restoration, so looking towards the future, but drawing really strongly on the past and relying a lot on the research that has already happened. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. So for this part, I will be asking questions to the panel, but I'll also open questions up to the floor. To start us off, a bit of a broad one initially, focused more towards Christine and Nick initially. We're looking to the future, we're looking at how we fix these problems and stuff. Is there advice you would give to the next generation of scientists coming through, essentially like Rebecca, moving upwards through early career science? What advice would you give looking forward?
What advice would you give to early career researchers?
Yes, as in when we're looking at all these big issues that we have moving forward. For tackling them, I suppose, is probably the thing that's more relevant to folks.
I think I'd say that, like we've kind of all mentioned, is looking to the past, like we talked about this morning, is reading and learning about what's been done, because like Christine's work is trying to bring a lot of information into the public domain so people can learn from what's been done. Reading that book that Christine lent me was a really big thing to learn from what's been done and what we had in the past. And if you don't know what we've done to change things for the worst and what things we did that worked well, then you can't move forward. So you need to have a direction, and that's learned from where you started and what was there before, and can we restore it, and how can we fix it. And so you need to look back first, then look forward. I think.
Absolutely. I think, like Christine, you mentioned SLECI, the Strangford Lough Ecological Change Investigation. I think that's a good microcosm. We knew a lot of stuff from that previously before. Have you seen that actually did get carried through? Like, was that knowledge used, or have we seen that we need to bring that into focus and sort of move forward with the information that we had?
With the SLECI survey in 2003, so yeah, I've made that all available on the portal. There were changes implemented by making a big exclusion zone for diving and for fishing, etc. The problem was that that habitat continued to degrade out of sight. Basically, no one was aware the extent to which the habitat had degraded. I mean, for me, in terms of, you know, where we need to go and what advice you would give to people, I think we need to think big, like Nick says. You know, what the Helen Scales book, What the Sea Could Be. For me, for that habitat, I think putting big blocks in to make sure if boats are coming in to bottom fish, they won't do it. And there's a lot of unfortunately, I think with the protection in Strangford Lough, there's a lot of bars to actually doing what needs to be done as well, you know, with oyster restoration, with creating artificial reefs that would enhance biodiversity and would prevent bottom trawling. And I think that would go some way. But yeah, that could be really cool research in the future for people. But we would have to get over some of those bars in legislation around the protection.
Absolutely. And Nick, I know that you yourself have been doing a lot of this oyster restoration work. It was really heartening as a marine scientist to see oysters going in at Belfast Lough finally. Do you foresee that more of that work is coming down the pipeline? Would you hope it is at least, but would you see it's practicable?
Loads. So our plan is to continue what we're doing in terms of oyster restoration, and then other projects at Ulster Wildlife. The CMAP project is working on salt marsh and seagrass. So and those kind of projects. So what we're trying to do is build that knowledge base of undertaking oyster restoration, putting things on the seabed in Belfast Lough, learning what those steps are, and then figuring out how we do it bigger and better each time. And so, that's what I'm looking for now, is bigger and better oyster reefs.
Good stuff. And do you think this stuff translates well to communities, for example? Like we talk about citizen science and stuff, is there good opportunities through this kind of work that they can take part?
Yeah, so it's a big part of how we work as well, is that our oyster work started, Heidi started it all off in Bangor Marina 4 years ago now, where we have oysters in cages underneath the pontoons in Bangor. We have now 4 oyster nurseries with oysters in the cages, and they're a broodstock of oysters. They produce larvae that go out into Belfast Lough and one at Glenarm that go out into the sea, and those are run by us, but they are supported overwhelmingly by volunteers, and those volunteers are essential to those oyster nurseries functioning. They help us monitor them and look after those oysters, and so they're an essential part of it. And we want to continue to involve community as a key part and a key stakeholder and a key participant in restoring our seas. So if we were to do something in Strangford Lough in the future, we would want to be with the community's direct involvement, and ideally with them literally holding an oyster and putting an oyster in the sea. That connection is important, because it's a big difference between saying no, you can't do anything in Strangford Lough, to giving people the opportunity to put some nature back and to do something positive. And I think that's a really powerful thing for building our connection to that importance of nature and the marine environment.
Absolutely. Is there anyone in the room that's like community representative, or even engages directly with communities, that thinks, hands up if you think there's people on the loch that you know that would do that kind of citizen science? 1 hand. 2 hands, 3 hands. So, like, through my own work as an engagement officer, we do find a lot of these communities that are hyper-focused, and they do want to look after their patches. So it is really good to see this kind of stuff coming down. Moving over to the WWT, from a land management perspective, how do you guys see the future moving forwards? Is it positive? Is there hope? Is there something beneficial from all this work coming out for you guys?
Well, yeah, I agree with Nick as regards, engaging with local communities. People only protect things and look after things if they understand them or if it's tangible to them. So that engagement is vital. But I feel that we can focus a lot on the sciences. We can look at degradation of habitats and so on, and we can communicate that, and we can quote stats ad nauseum. And a lot of people will take that on board and they will understand that, but a lot of people won't, because it doesn't affect them directly. And that's just the world we're living in. So people perhaps away from the coastline won't be concerned, they won't understand it, they'll hear it on the news maybe, but they won't necessarily engage with it, and they'll forget about it as soon as shortly after they've heard it. So we need to really engage people through community science projects, yes, but I also feel through the arts. And celebrating nature and celebrating the loch through the arts is important. Our founder for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, Sir Peter Scott, said that the only way to save the natural world is to cause people to fall in love with it again. And I very much feel that environmental protection is as much about the arts as it is about the sciences.
Good stuff. Yeah, like I've been out to schools, and you'd be surprised how little people know in schools, and it's all down to teachers' willpower, which it shouldn't be. So yeah, getting those good news stories out, I think, is a big thing. We get a lot of doom and gloom with climate change and climate adaptation and all this kind of stuff, these big scary things, and they are things to consider and to be worried about. But there are good news stories. There's people trying to help, like yourselves. So it's good to see it. There's a thing, how do we get good news stories in a practical sense out and keep the momentum building and keep people focused? Is there any sort of practical ideas that you guys have or that you've seen work where you can get these good news stories out and bring more people in so they do get involved in this kind of stuff?
One angle, maybe controversially, is to talk about the natural capital and the economy and the economic benefits. A lot of people balk at that, and I understand why, but this is the world we're living in. So we need to have several strings to our bow: the sciences, the arts, economy. You take a facility like Castlelesby. We have a restaurant, cafe. We employ people. We are part of the economy. We are celebrating the natural capital of Strangford Lough, and that is economically viable. So yeah, that's one way of going at it.
And have you found that businesses sometimes will partner for you in that, or is it just entirely on your own back, you're focusing on natural capital? If you know what I mean. Have other people bought into that idea?
Yeah, I think so. We hope that people come along and they take the message away with them as well. So that's an important part of what we do.
Okay, perfect. Opening it up to the floor a little bit. Does anybody have any good examples of good news stories that they've heard recently they want to highlight to the group? Hands up. I mean, we do, but I'm chairing, be a bit rude. We did just put in, not to self-plug, so we put in some vertiples recently, and actually Anna, our MPA officer, spearheaded that, not me. I'm just taking some of the glory. It was on BBC News, it's quite nice. But basically to increase biodiversity, green the grey, we have loads of seawalls and hard infrastructure that are not really going to go anywhere anytime soon because of how everything's built. But in the meantime, we can do small things to make them more biodiverse, and that was one of those things that we did at Strangford Lough Yacht Club. And we're also looking to move on with our eco-marines project as well, that lifts marines off the ground to protect our seagrass beds and stuff. But yes, anybody in the audience have any good news stories they'd like to share? Yeah, go for
I was
it.
just going to go back to the two new seagrass beds that were found as a consequence of DERA funding that project, were the Coastal Observatory project, and then Rebecca, being an absolutely star and fabulous student, looking at it and going, I think they might be seagrass beds, but they're not currently mapped. And then in collaboration with the diving club and then with the marine lab, going out and ground truthing it and finding really quite substantial seagrass beds that we didn't know about. And it did hit the media. It got people in the diving club thinking like, oh yeah, there's so much discovery still to be, people like feeling they're part of that. So yeah, well done.
And to focus in on that, Rebecca, what's the next step? You've found the seagrass beds. What are you planning to do next?
I mean, preferably find an oyster reef. That would be quite nice.
Just to keep Nick happy, yeah. But seagrass, really interesting one. We've seen some really cool recovery quite quickly using our eco-marines and stuff, so it seems to grow quite well when you give it the chance. What sort of future research do you see coming out of this?
I think so. With those two new seagrass beds, it's because there's only a few kind of largest seagrass beds already mapped and known within Strangford. It really increases the kind of total biomass that we're aware of. So it very much contributes to things like the Blue Carbon Action Plan and making sure that we know where things are, so we know what we need to protect. We know what I don't like calling it environmental resource, but what environmental resources are there and where we need to coordinate our efforts. So part of my research is trying to look at things from a seascape perspective, so Strangford Lough as an entire loch instead of just individual habitats. So the next step in that research is to try and work out Do we have a network of biogenic habitats? If there was a network, is it really degraded? So at the minute, it's kind of like filling in the gaps. So, okay, we have seagrass here, we don't have oysters here, we have marl here. So it's trying to work out where is everything and how can we use that to kind of improve and move on a bit further with marine restoration if that's the direction that we're going to go in.
Good stuff. I find like doing this kind of work, a lot of people know Strangford Lough in the wider public, that they know it's vaguely protected in some way and they know it's vaguely important in some way to do with biodiversity, but I don't think they know the challenges that it faces apart from people who are local. Have you found that there's a way to get the situation across to people without depressing them, essentially, to be like, look, we do have still incredible biodiversity despite the fact the system is degraded and it's known to be degraded? And yeah, what your experience is around that. Essentially, how do you foster hope? Big question.
Yeah.
And that's open to the whole panel, and also if people on the floor have an idea about that.
I usually try and focus on what people can actually do. So like you can say, right, this area is pretty good, but the rest of it's not great. But people are usually much more responsive if you can say, this is what you can do as a person right now, instead of saying, theoretically, this is what we as a country should be doing, which is never going to happen. You know, if you can break it down to individual action, you know, it can be something like, I don't know, emailing an MP or, you know, trying to just encourage people to talk about it to other people. A lot of it is trying to normalise it. I think for a lot of people, they think that the marine environment or marine science is something that's really aloof and that, you know, I know really smart people with PhDs do that and that's nothing to do with us, which is completely wrong, obviously. So part of it is trying to get people to talk about the marine environment in everyday life and to get the message across to people that this belongs to you as well as to everyone else and you have a responsibility to protect it, which you can do. It's not out of your hands. So that's my perspective. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts.
Go ahead, Isabel.
Yeah, I think you're right, Rebecca. I'd also like to see, and it goes back to the Curriculum Council, I'd like to see the schools get and take access to, for example, all of the marine portal work that Christine's been doing. Ideally, identifying the seabed beside their community so that they know what's there. They can see it. They can identify it. They can identify the species that are there. And they can take ownership of it in a way that they wouldn't otherwise unless they knew what was there.
I'm going to say,
Go ahead, Christine.
I'm a big fan of Caroline Lucas. I think she's really spot on. And I mean, for years, she's been campaigning to try and get a GCSE in natural history in general, both on land and in the sea. Things that people used to know, standard flowers, trees, marine life, a lot of people are, it's just not on the curriculum anywhere. And you know, most people live in cities and are disconnected from that. But even people in coastal areas will often not know what the things are. So, yeah, I think we could start by getting that onto the curriculum.
One of the things you asked, what's next after you find your seagrass beds? One of the frustrating things, I suppose, about the sea is it's not like land. It's not immediately amenable to practical measures by members of the public, by citizen groups, by local communities. It's not like you can go and plant marram grass as you can in sand dunes. But one thing you can do is help with monitoring and help with measuring. A growing kind of trend we see now in the Republic of Ireland is for groups to adopt seagrass beds and to monitor their extent on an annual basis. Because it's one thing knowing the seagrass is there. It's another thing understanding whether it's declining or increasing or stable. So that's the kind of thing that citizen science can contribute to, in addition to the collection of data through citizen science projects that Christine was highlighting earlier. Data is the one big thing we lack, and it's the one big impediment, or a big impediment, to conservation of marine habitats. So That's one way the public can get involved and feel that they're making a useful contribution.
That's very interesting, actually. How do they keep an eye on the extent from a citizen perspective?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, if it's an intertidal bed, that's easy enough. You walk the boundary with your GPS in hand. And then if it's subtidal, well, to a certain extent, you can monitor the extent of a shallow subtidal seagrass bed through snorkeling. Basically, same gig. You snorkel the outside of the extremities of the bed, towing your GPS either on your back or on a float. To monitor the outer extent of the bed, you probably need either divers or some gadgets, such as ROVs. But certainly, even if you monitored the kind of dive or snorkelable extent of a seagrass bed, it would give you an indication of what is happening to that bed year on year.
Good stuff. I think Emma next.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to a wee bit about some of the schools work. Becca and myself recently are working with the 2 schools in Kirkcaldy, so trying to get them to work together and actually using the data portal. So I know we sort of talked about it's nice to always show positivity, but I think even showing kind of kids at P7 age, this is what a good modiolus bed looks like, and this is what Strangford modiolus beds look like. You know, they could see instantly. You know, and you're not trying to leave them with something depressing. You're leading on to then. They're going to do some monitoring on the beach. We're going to take them down. We're going to show them some survey techniques. They're going to design their own experiment around that. And then they're going to use the game that you guys might have seen downstairs as well to kind of try and maybe classify some of the animals that they're seeing and, you know, engage a bit with their local biodiversity. And it is very much what's happening on their doorstep. So we've been really fortunate. The Royal Society had some seed funding to kind of help with getting the kids down. We'll be bringing them down to the lab. And unfortunately, we do tend to kind of focus on the local schools. And I know probably this is the type of work that we need to be doing, maybe more with schools who aren't getting the opportunity to come to the beach all that often. But I suppose it's just a terms of resources and the number of people that we have out and able to do this. But we are trying to do a little bit of that in local schools as well.
Yeah, I find even very close to the coast, but just off it, kids don't even get down to the coast as much as they should. I've done some stuff in Ring of Gullion as part of our geopark work, and even there, obviously they know the mountains and the stuff, but they're just around the corner from Strangford Lough, but that you would have no idea that they even know it's there, which is kind of mad. So when you show them something like a crab and they freak out, like, it's quite good. Yes, go ahead.
It's just a suggestion. We don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. The good news is that several wheels have been invented before. One of them, for example, is the community work on Arran Island in Scotland in the Clyde, which created a marine reserve there, voluntary marine reserve, I think, although I think it might have legislative clout behind it now. I'm not sure. And there are other initiatives as well. And maybe one of the things we could do is either have a real conference or a virtual one through the internet, bringing together community groups who have already achieved local marine, voluntary marine reserves, both on the shoreline and possibly underneath, as Arran Island is, for example, and bring them together. Let's learn what we can from them and then take it from there.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So all of the speakers, even in the first panel, have talked about learning from what's gone before and documenting and using data from previous projects. So we can all agree that we need to use that to inform what we do next. But do we have an agreed idea of what next is supposed to be? Like, what's the goal, and who's on board with that goal and who's not?
I'd say the question is to everyone here, though, of what's their goal? Like, what are your goals? What would you see? Do you believe Strangford Lough is fine the way it is right now? Or what would you want it to look like in 10 years' time or 20 years' time or 100 years' time? And that's really a question for everyone, I think.
I spent 23 years running a field study centre in Bryansford, and teaching youngsters about the local environment as widely as possible. Admittedly, nothing subsea. The furthest we got was the kelp beds at the lowest tide, but we did map the shore environmentally. And I think it's like all of the issues that we're coming across, it doesn't matter whether it's marine or not, we need to make sure that the youngsters understand what has happened and the mistakes that we've all made and how to cope in the future. We know how to cope in the future. I mean, it's not rocket science to protect areas, but we need to get the youngsters on board, and we need to have them understanding the importance of it. And that, I'm sorry, it goes back into schools, and also youth groups, sports groups, all of those kind of instances of access to youngsters.
I was just going to say that. Where's my mic on?
Yeah, just takes a wee second.
Okay. I think in addition to all of those things, we also need to have proper policing of marine protected areas, because it's not happening, and just saying it's a protected area and keeping everyone out so no one got to see what was actually happening within that massive exclusion zone. It doesn't help. The fact that in Northern Ireland, the fisheries protection vessel has been tied up for several years now and not out in operation in Strangford Lough. Who at night, you know, if we have technology, we could have both like sonar and cameras that can detect boats coming in. Rathlin has a big exclusion zone around it for bottom fishing, and we were on the east coast on Monday, and the habitats that were there, massive sponges that were probably several hundred years old, that's all gone from scallop trawling again. So, you know, really, we need to have, of course, education, community engagement, community support, but we really need to have some teeth as well when it comes to conservation, identify the areas that are good, big buffer zones around them that are also being policed to prevent the devastating impact of bottom fishing.
I agree, and I think, but I also think that we can rely on policing of it in terms of DERA or the police, but also custodians of places like Strangford Lough, the people around the shores, and I think building that connection to the loch, people, you know, like Rory being out there on the loch regularly and doing that kind of, literally being part of the loch and it being part of the economy of Northern Ireland and of Ireland, like, that's a really important thing. For example, you know, when the first ospreys returned and RSPB had these nests, there was two ways to do this and protect these really rare species. One was you don't tell anyone they're there and you keep them hidden to hope that no one finds these eggs, or you stick a visitor centre next to it with a camera pointed at it, with a warden around it showing everyone where this osprey nest is. And so no one's going to chance it because it's always being watched. And so there's that safety in the eyes of everyone, is that ability to kind of protect the loch through the community involvement. And I think that could be a really powerful way to save, you know, every government is struggling to put any money into doing more. And therefore maybe it's about the community coming out and being a big part of the loch and a big part of our seas and bringing that connection. And whether that's walking along the coast, doing Shore and I, like Anna's running with Ulster Wildlife, of being out there and documenting what you're seeing, and being out there on the loch more often, and the coastal rowers and everyone who's using the loch could be those custodians, could be the de facto police, the vigilantes and the Batman, Spider-Man of the sea. Spider crab.
Wouldn't work for 3 a.m. in the morning, which is when the boats come in.
Can I just expand on some of the things I heard of? Yes, better policing, of course, education, of course, and talking to politicians. I feel though, I mean, someone mentioned a GCSE in sort of the natural sciences or ecology or whatever branch of it. I think now is absolutely the time for that, no matter where you're coming from. Now is the time for that. You think years ago, we had GCSEs in, sort of engineering and metalwork, because that's where the jobs were. So we were training our kids to get jobs and to blend into the economy. Those jobs aren't there the way they used to be. And we need the kids not only to be economically active, but educated on the environment. So I think now is the time for GCSE in some sort of natural science, irrespective of your own views or interest in the environment, because it's relevant, it's part of the economy. So now is the time. Another thing, though, that concerns me a little is the politics, particularly in Northern Ireland. Everyone needs to talk to their MPs, they need to talk to their MLAs when they come around the doors about these things. But I don't know about you guys, but I find it utterly depressing when you discuss the environment or environmental issues that it seems to be divided down green-orange lines, and people seem to default to this. It's mind-boggling. So, I mean, even environmental policy, it depends on what minister is actually in post at the time. We've got to change that. We've got to change that narrative. I don't necessarily have the answers. Keep on asking the questions, irrespective of your views on the constitutional position. That's not what it's about. It's about the future. Everyone of every colour lives around the loch and depends on the natural environment. And we need to change the narrative on that politically, I think.
I was just on the question about where do we go and who do we engage, and there was a lot brought up about kind of the younger generation and children, and I think that's really important. But like if you look at the picture that's behind you, you can see that like all of the land like is developed into farms, and I just wonder if there's like the same kind of partnerships with like farmers and landowners going on, because there's quite a lot of those initiatives for like terrestrial wildlife. Obviously like the RSPB like would interact quite a lot with like farmers in terms of like how they can better manage their land for terrestrial wildlife and birds. But sometimes I feel as if maybe the marine environment and the loch is something that's left out of those discussions, and it's as many of the speakers have mentioned, the impact that you have on the land is one of the massive things that has an impact on the water. So I think it's about kind of bringing that together, and also talking to the economic actors is something that's also very important.
Yeah. Absolutely. Do you want to go, Judith?
To answer that question.
Yeah, so in answer to that, I am the AONB officer for Strangford Lough, so I am working in and around the land around the loch, but what we have done recently and are waiting on an outcome of is an application to the National Lottery for a landscape connections project, which will be doing exactly what you're talking about. It's working with the landowners, the communities around the loch to deliver projects which will protect the loch, but focusing mainly on the land. So we should know an outcome of that application in June. If everybody would keep their fingers crossed, that would be really, really good. So it is something that has been thought of. We're working towards it.
And we have seen success elsewhere. We talk about the mix between the scientific and the cultural and the heritage. Down in Carlingford Lough, there was the Shifting Tides project, which brought together artists and aquaculturists and all sorts of different people. And because they weren't necessarily the big regulatory bodies, and it was artists going out to do things, there was actually really good conversations had about everybody owning the ocean and it being a collective good. So there's definitely ways to do that. Robert.
I promise I'll keep this short. Robert Walsh, Northern Ireland Marine Task Force. So just a brief bit on the politics. Yeah, we are seeing that division in terms of the kind of orange and green, but we're also seeing that siloed mentality across departments as well. when the executive came back in 2024, we wrote to each of the ministers wanting to engage with them on marine. And I thought I would just share some of the responses that we got. DERA, we already engage with. Economy, we already engage with. Didn't get a response from health. Education, we're very, very keen to meet with us, so that was good, considering that a lot of the conversation today has focused around that. And my favourite one was communities, who said, marine has nothing to do with us. Have you heard of DERA?
I think as well, education can somewhat solve the political issue. When you go in and you talk to schools or community groups or whoever it may be, oftentimes when everybody realises, oh, actually, it doesn't really matter what sort of line you vote down, this is a collective issue that everybody should be engaged in. I think people start realising that, and it's just being open and honest about that. So yeah. Okay.
Can I ask another question?
Of course.
This one's for Paul kind of specifically, but maybe other people have insights. I'm sure you get lots of visitors to Castle Espy who come from, further distances away. It's not necessarily right on their doorstep. But how do you, have you learned anything really about how you convert that kind of one visit to a more sustained connection with nature, or any behaviour changes that we could apply in our other community engagement projects or citizen science initiatives?
When you say from further afield, you mean like overseas?
I just mean that I'm sure you have a few people who come regularly. Yeah. I go all the time because it's my favourite place. But people who maybe have just come for the day, and then how do you convert them to stay?
Yeah, one of the joys of my job is actually people coming from Belfast. I had a group down recently from West Belfast. They never even knew Castle Espy existed. They just were blown away by the beauty of it. Luckily, the weather was good. Yes, reaching those groups and marginalised groups, or groups that wouldn't normally access that, and sparking that interest. We have an education programme. We have information on site. We do notice that a lot of the people who volunteer or go on to be employed with us all say they came to Castle Espy as kids. And so that's job done, really, isn't it? So yeah, look, if we have 100,000 people come through and 1,000 of them become interested in nature and protecting the environment, we've done a good thing. The more the merrier. That's all we can do, is keep on banging the drum, teaching people about it. Directly through formal education, which we do, but informally as well through activities and things that we have on site.
I was going to say that, we have the aquarium just down the road. When it was first set up, it was very much an interpretive centre for Strangford Lough. It's kind of lost that connection now, and it would be really nice to inject more local focus back into the aquarium, because it does attract visitors and children and school groups from all across the province.
Christine, you are so right. And I was part of a group with Pat Bowden, who actually went to Ards and North Down Council and discussed at length with them about it. And they nodded sympathetically with the sort of enthusiastic nod that made you quite clear they weren't going to do anything. And that is what happened. And instead you have sort of pirate-themed and tropical fishing and penguin. Yes, exactly. It's very regrettable, and it's just that the council had not got the vision. I think it is time to go back to them and revisit that, because now the profile of the marine concerns is so much greater. We probably have a slightly more fertile ground to be working there.
I suppose you may struggle in terms of the fact that it is now privately owned. Just from my own knowledge, it's a frustration, because I grew up going to the aquarium back when it was council run, and I always assumed that it would stay native species. So yeah, ending up working there when it was tropical was a big change. But yes, now that it's privately owned, convincing, like we talked about natural capital and stuff, convincing capitalist interests to not continue to be is going to be the difficulty there, probably. Because the wider scope for a lot of people, I find, is the economic scope. And we do come into communities sometimes as scientists or legislators and come to fishermen or farmers and ask them to take really serious financial hits and change economies. So I think it might be difficult. It's worth doing 100%, but we have to be conscious of socioeconomic things that are going on outside of our willpower to do something good for the environment. At least that's what I found in my experience. But yeah, I'll potentially be in the battle ramparts for that at some point, but we'll see how that goes.
In relation to the aquarium, there is the Galway Atlantiquaria, which focuses on native species. They are a member of the IOLN. I don't know if they're flush, but maybe, it's worth seeing how they've continued to keep true to it being Irish focused.
Yeah. The other thing is, just on that point, we're focusing on Strangford for obvious reasons. We're in Strangford, we want to hear about Strangford locally. But as a geopark, so we're from Morngully and Strangford Geopark, an AONB team. What we do a lot is we go to other geoparks and we learn about best practice that they have. So definitely send your feelers out into the wider network through people like IOLN, because there's lots of good practice happening. It's not always well advertised or out in the media. But yeah, there's some phenomenal restoration work going around, and there's some phenomenal work in general going around in the marine environment. So don't always just focus on your local area, because you might get some ideas from somewhere a little bit further afoot that work just as well. So yeah.
Time for one last question.
If you sit and look at that nice picture there, one thing that stands out is the farming land on the edge of the loch. Is there much systematic engagement with farmers?
That's what that big landscape connection thing is planning, because currently not so much. There's some that are involved in agri-environment schemes. There's some that are environmentally minded, but it needs to be expanded on.
To come back
Unless anybody else wants to add to that.
What you said, Isabel said earlier about a lot of Strangford being inaccessible and little bits where people can actually get to, and how wonderful it would be if there were a lot more walking tracks around Strangford Lough. It is farmed right to the edge of the high water mark for the most part. I mean, we do have Castle Ward, there's Mount Stewart, but a lot of the loch isn't accessible, and I think by making it more accessible would help. Having more of a buffer that isn't farmed right to the edge, but is also accessible for people would actually enhance the people's experience, people's connection, as well as the ecology.
Hi there, Heather Ritchie from Queen's University in Belfast. I'm in the School of Natural and Built Environment in the planning team, and I just want to highlight a project that's a little bit similar to Shifting Tides that we didn't realise when we wrote the application, and it's called Tracks. We're looking on the foil, and we are looking at resilient coastal communities and transformative actions, and we're really working in a very disciplinary way, working with scientists but also with arts-based methods. And one of the things, just when you were saying about access, we have noticed in the foil that access is a major, major issue, and we're looking at around marine identity as well, and people don't have maybe the same affinity with the foil that they do with Strangford Lough. And we think one of the big major things is on access, and actually being able to physically access the foil is so protected by fences, by boundaries, by farmland, on both sides of it as well. So we're looking at a cross-border project on that. And one of the things that we're trying to do is actually to work on identity, but also using our arts-based methods and looking at soundscapes and how we can explore different identities around that. And we've got one of my colleagues, Sarah, here, just behind me. She's there. That's hopefully going to be doing a soundscape and looking at using local choirs to really get people to connect with their identity on the foil. But there's a lot of very similar aspects coming out from what happened in Shifting Tides, which was really, really interesting. But just about the whole issue of identity and access is massive, one of the big themes that we've been really pulling out.
Good stuff. Oh, go ahead.
Just to answer that from Christine, it would be great if we had much more visibility of the loch. It would also potentially reduce the amount of rock armouring around the loch, because the rock armouring that's happening produces what's called coastal squeeze, which I'm sure most of you understand, and is very anti biodiversity as far as the upper shore is concerned. If the councils, for example, had control of the margin, the upper margin of the shore as a walkway, and didn't rock armour it, then I think that would be a positive step.
Thought you were going to go, Nick?
Just to add to the comments about the foil, we've been doing surveys of Larne Loch, and to be honest, I'd say Strangford Lough is one of the most accessible sea lochs in Northern Ireland. It still needs work more, and I think I agree that more would be much better. Like I said about that kind of community policing of practices around the loch would be helped by more access, but in terms of Northern Ireland and access to Larne Loch, to the foil, it is tough to try and survey the shores. So I think it's a massive wider problem that needs addressing of the way we use this space. Like, it's not just for one person to have access to. It should be for more people, more accessible.
Speaking of access to Larne, I jumped off the bridge to get access to my survey site, so it's one of the worst.
Yeah.
Don't tell Dira. Don't tell Queen. I did it with my 75-year-old father, who also jumped off the bridge. Okay, I think we'll wrap up this panel. Thank you so much to our speakers and our moderator. That was a really, really good conversation. So hopefully you find those conversations maybe interesting, maybe they've sparked some thoughts for you today. There's a lot of different themes that we touched on. How the past is going to really inform and play into what we decide to do in the future, but how there's a real need to document our past, transmit it forward digitally and through experience to keep it alive. Experiences really seem to be a key way of us to encourage connection to the sea. That came out through all of our speakers today, and that can be arts-based, recreationally based, culturally and historically based. But also, I think we have a real issue around who gets to experience Strangford Lough and the other parts of Northern Ireland's coastline. So that's something we need to grapple with. How do we increase access but also protect the beautiful place that people are coming to see and not put additional pressures on it? The land-sea connection came out a lot, mostly in a negative way, so maybe we need to widen who we're speaking to and start inserting the marine environment into conversations that are happening elsewhere. It came up also about learning from each other, so we can learn from best practice examples, not just around the island, but also from further afield, to come up with our own ideas of how we want Strangford Lough to look. In that last panel, I did ask, what is the goal? Do we have an agreed goal? I don't think we got an answer. And so in the last sort of 10 minutes of this event, I would love to hear a bit more from everyone in the room, not about what the goal is, it's too much to really come together with a vision, but just small steps. What is next? You know, we've heard about the past, how it informs our future, but what do you want the future to look like? What do you want people to be doing? Who do you want to be involved? And we're going to capture this conversation everything's being recorded, and we'll put that together in a bit of a report and share that with everybody. So what do you do next? Oh, I was the roaming microphone.
Can I start?
Yes, and then we'll hand back to Gavin.
So to start off, one of the things I want to say to start off the conversation, a word I've noticed being used over and over again today, engagement. Yeah. This to me is phenomenal. I've been working in science communications community engagement for years. Up until now, it's always been about people saying, we're going to educate the local communities, but that language has moved. Everybody in the room here, particularly in panel 2, was saying about engagement, and that's a huge way. Engagement, and Rebecca, you mentioned local environmental knowledge. So what Heidi's asking us to do now is, how do we maybe further this engagement? How do we further local environmental knowledge? How do we bring together scientists, or maybe everybody on the loch together, to further engagement, to act for our marine environment? So I want to say thank you. It's been phenomenal hearing from everybody today, and I really, really loved hearing that word engagement over and over again. Okay.
Yeah, being an engagement officer, it's great to hear that people like that word. Most of the time they don't. No, yeah, I think the very first step is interconnectivity. It is groups like this, and it's getting more people to realise that there are networks already existing, like Bob mentioned, not reinventing the wheel. We have a lot of management groups, we have a lot of network groups, and it's just getting more local voices onto those groups so that we have more people engaged. I think that's a really big first step. And yeah, not talking down to them, not trying to educate them, like you say.
Can I just add to Gavin's comment that up until quite recently, really, most of the organisations in this room wouldn't have had, or have had previously, and have lost the funding for what would have been education officers, but engagement officers. Gavin's quite rare at the moment. But peace funding now is changing that, and I think we will start to see a few more engagement officers on the ground. But up until quite recently, it wasn't really, it was an add-on to our day job. It wasn't the main focus of what most of us were doing, and it's been quite difficult to include a lot of that in what we do. But I do think that's also starting to change through the funding, like the peace money and that sort of thing. So the future looks positive in that sense.
I'm going to pass it forward.
If we're just making wishes for like what we kind of want in the future, marine protected areas that are actively managed, not just managed on paper, but the actions that we are saying need to take place to protect them take place, but the protections don't hinder restoration. Because I found sometimes that the protections that are in place become big hurdles to restoration efforts, but people can just come in at night and troll it. So, I don't know, it's that policing and that making sure that the protections that we do need don't hinder the things that are good, I suppose. I don't know how to phrase it, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good, thank you. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Heidi, I can speak.
No, we need to use it, otherwise people can't hear on the tape.
You know, we have been hearing the word restoration quite a bit today, which is, you know, absolutely we need to be restoring habitats, but to restore a habitat to something that is actually still there and is diverse and has probably taken thousands of years to form, for those species to come together to form that habitat, really better protection of the areas that we still have. I don't think we have that, but I think we desperately need it, and we need to have a buffer zone around them to allow those areas to expand naturally, as well as restoration in areas that are degraded.
Well, we're on the personal rants campaign. I'll join in by saying monitoring. I mean, there's no way we should be surprised at finding that horse mussels have now completely disappeared from large areas of the loch. that should have been seen as it was happening with constant monitoring and adequate monitoring. And it's obvious there isn't that. Even the seagrass beds, we're not seeing the level of monitoring that's required. I'm blue in the face asking about the seagrass bed in Glenarm, since it was discovered about 10 years ago. Yeah, and without that monitoring, without that data, then it's kind of, where do you start? It's chicken and egg. You can have all the management plans in the world, but if you've inadequate enforcement, inadequate monitoring, it's all for naught. And certainly when I first arrived up and started working for Ulster Wildlife as Living Seas officer, we were talking about management plans for North Coast MPAs. I think we're still talking about management plans for North Coast MPAs, which is shocking, absolutely shocking. So, yeah, I mean, there's always so much we as the public can do, other than putting pressure on. But we need to see better enforcement of the legislation that's there. Also, I suppose we've seen some people mentioned earlier that we've seen some rollback on engagement. Unfortunately, we see from a lot of funders where they like to fund engagement, but for 3 years, and that stops. We need to get the message through that engagement has to be constant. The minute you take your foot off the brake with engagement, everything just starts to roll back. So it has to be constant. It has to be year on year on year. And of course, that would be best of all if we could get it incorporated into the school's curriculum. But, even when we were I used to have great crack in Ulster Wildlife. We took kids out snorkeling. We were never off the shore. But we're not seeing that level of engagement being maintained. And it has to be. And if necessary, more. We need to see more engagement.
Yeah, just to take that a stage further, with the horse mussel beds, I've always had the view that these actually were a post-glacial feature. In other words, they've been around as a habitat for maybe 1,000 years or several thousand years, not sure quite which, but a long, long time. And yes, now we have more or less lost those mussel beds, but as just said, to take the foot off the brake now and just release the lock from the protection that it's got belatedly would be a big mistake. Don't let us think that the habitats that are coming in at present after the horse mussel beds are the ones that we're going to end up with in the long term. These habitats are evolving and changing very, very slowly. So to pick up on that point, yes, we need to have long-term measures. And the trouble is our political system is full of short-termism. And somehow we have got to move society into a position where politicians realize that they are going to feel the pinch if they start messing around with the long-term aspirations of society. And we aren't there yet, but that's one of the big things that we need to see for the future.
I started chairing the Marine Protected Area Stakeholder Group. Was it 5 years ago? Something like that. 22. Sorry? 2022. Thank you. And we spent quite a long time identifying issues and then categorizing them and then grouping them and all the rest of it. But what we did was we came up with some that we felt that we could address. Now, I'm getting the same sort of feeling from this afternoon, from today. And I'm wondering, can I make a suggestion in a sense that could come out of today? And that is that we attempt to contact communities, and one of the working groups in the MPA stakeholder group is community engagement. And therefore that's a route into it. And try and get communities, if they are close to, for example, a seagrass bed, or if they can have identifiable coastal elements that they could adopt, and just see if we can get communities to adopt a bit of their loch. Monitoring, perhaps, certainly being aware of it and spreading the word about it. That would be my suggestion coming out of today.
Down the back. Can we pass the mic?
Sorry for anyone who's fed up hearing my voice, but yeah, just to highlight that stakeholder group for anyone who is not familiar, though most people in here probably will be, is always looking for members. If you know people in organisations or in community groups that want to be on it, especially people in community groups because they're currently underrepresented, we want more of them. We want as many voices as possible without going too far on these stakeholder groups, so that we get a much broader range of what issues are at hand. Do you know? Like we started the eco-merns project, and then Anna suddenly stumbled across a guy who had eco-merns for 20 years, do you know, that wasn't known before, and that was all through community engagement. So yeah, we need more of that. And there is means to get your voice heard higher up the chain that way, because a lot of our big organisations like DERA and NIA sit on these groups, so you can get these issues directly to officers on the ground. So there is means and modes, and there is action to be taken, regardless of wider efforts to do with big sort of strategies and stuff. We obviously do want to align with those, but there is ways to keep going and keep getting work done, and to also directly interact with people on the ground across all agencies and across communities.
Oh, sorry. Okay, we're done to stand now. I'm wondering, there's a lot of talk about marine protected areas and stakeholder engagement and that sort of thing. One of the things that comes to mind when we're talking about marine protected areas is people think there's one size fits all. It's just marine protected areas, one particular thing. I'm not sure of how the legislation is in the north, but from working in Asia for years ago, we were setting up LMMA, so locally managed marine protected areas, where the stakeholders in that particular area work very closely with the government to manage and implement not just monitoring or overseeing things, but also protection of that particular area. I wonder if locally managed marine areas have been introduced to the concept in the north, or if there's any potential of something like that happening, because it seems to me that there's a lot of will in Strangford, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of monitoring, there's a lot of public engagement, there's a strong sense of connection to the loch from marine identity. I'm just throwing the idea out there, and I'm probably going to run and hide after saying this. I'm not putting you on the spot. Is something like that a potential? Has it even been discussed?
I feel like that was very targeted towards me. No, I'm joking. No, in a good way, in a good way. So I think that was at the kind of Strangford MPA steering group. I think that was one of the things that was discussed at great length, whether or not it was the stakeholders currently in the working groups, or we open it to include members of the public. And I think the end result was for it to open up to members of the public to have that kind of greater understanding and involvement from society that live around the loch, that maybe haven't had the opportunity yet to get involved in those working groups. I don't think we have any kind of locally managed marine protected areas that I'm aware of. The closest you could probably get would be the areas of special scientific interest around the coast. But I think that's mainly down to like citizen science projects like Sea Search or Shore NI, rather than people actually kind of boots on the ground, monitoring, management, that sort of thing. But definitely it's something that we've been advocating strongly for from the community engagement strands of any consultation on management measures, is that it's done in conjunction with the Department for Communities, and that people locally have their say and the ability to contribute and feel involved in the management, protection, and quite frankly, the ownership of those sites. Yeah.
Any final thoughts? Yes?
Well, there we go. One thing that I was going to say, not relevant to locally managed MPAs, is, and I come from DERA, by the way, I've been trying to hide. I work in marine strategy, so this is my cup of tea. But one thing from working on the sort of legislation side as well, I would tell people is do respond to public consultations, because we had quite a significant one. I'm not going to go into detail that went through there, and I think we had 40 responses. So 20 of those just from regular people, but that makes up 50% of the vote. We've had times where the First Minister has written to us and said, 50% of the people are not satisfied with, say, this part or this part or this part. Explain that. And, you can't, if you've got numbers there and you've got real legitimate interests and things that you're concerned with, you're not just throwing it into some well by responding to a public consultation. It will be accountable. And I think that's a positive way to put your voice forward, even if you think that maybe you're sort of fighting a losing battle whenever you're messaging Dara. And I do agree. I'm careful with what I say. Contact your politicians and make sure you get represented, because there are plenty of people within Dara and marine and fisheries that are interested and start out the same way you do, looking at the sea and thinking, how can we fix it? And that's certainly something I'm aiming to do. Thank you.
To be Dara, so he's not alone.
I'll just say we mentioned kind of community-based MPAs. We spent 6 years at Ulster Wildlife when I arrived up here 12 years ago, looking at that very question, and it was great fun, and it was hugely interesting, and it was very rewarding to engage with local communities. But I think the one clear thing that came out of that project was that if you want a successful community-based marine protected area, the impetus has to come from the community. So you as an engagement person can only do so much, but really the love of the area and the want to protect it has to come from the community itself. You can't almost impose a community protected area on a local community. So I think that indicates that what we have to invest most of our efforts in is developing that love for the sea.
I just want to advertise an opportunity for any of the organisations here to advertise their wares at the Skiffy Fest event at Delamont on the 30th, 31st of July and the 1st of August. There will be a gazebo if you need it. It's open to the public. It will have a wide range of skiffs from all around Strangford and also from Scotland and England. So you're more than welcome there. Heidi's got my email address.
Thank you. That's a wonderful invitation. So to summarise where I think we've landed after today: priorities, sustained engagement, which requires funding, ideas like Adopt the Spot, but also existing networks, programs, management groups. They already exist, so let's make sure we're linking up. We need to enforce MPA legislation, but not have it hinder restoration, and protection is best. We need more monitoring, but we are monitoring, so maybe we need to monitor the right way in the right place. And long-term thinking, which I think is all about the education piece that we've been talking about, that intergenerational, fostering that connection at a young age. Political pressure, respond to your consultations, it matters. And maybe there might be in the future space in Northern Ireland for locally managed MPAs or voluntary type MPAs. But like Dave said, it has to come from deep within the community. They have to want it. And Bob shared earlier on about examples that we could learn from in Aran Island. So I think that was a good day's work. These QR codes, one will take you to our website if you want to find out more about being an IOLN member. Thank you so much, everybody.